All right, hey, how's it going? All right, so I just wanted to give you guys an idea about how these literary movements work, kind of as a global perspective. So it's not a literature class per se, but it's kind of interesting how this works. So maybe if you can visualize this, this will help you for other classes in literature you're taking, or in other courses where even in analysis it helps understand a lot of this. So when you're talking about literature, you could kind of sum things up in terms of literature and art and music and philosophy. A lot of the arts share a lot of characteristics as they move through the ages. So I'm going to write down some movements here, and I want you to just kind of think about these as as units, okay, and as actions and reactions, because they're the type of thing that that develop from previous movements. And you could see we kind of move from subject to object here, and I'll explain that in a minute. So as you're thinking about these types of movements, it's kind of interesting to think about how they work. Obviously, this is more of something you can apply to art, but if you look at like Romanesque architecture, it's kind of like this, right? And then Gothic architecture would be like this. And then when you get back to Renaissance, they go back to the classic style, and they go back to the classic style again, and they go back to the classic here again. So it's kind of interesting because things move along at a pace from subject to object. Everything's kind of an action and a reaction. So think about Romanesque as being kind of like an objective movement, and this would be subjective, and again objective, and this is subjective, objective, subjective, objective, subjective, etc. So it's not exactly broken down that way, but it's kind of interesting when you think about this in terms of the literature, because a lot of the literature where we're going to enter in this will be in the Renaissance, and you'll see a lot of form in the Renaissance, and then when you get to Baroque, it's back to subject. What I mean by subject and object is when you have Renaissance or neoclassic literature or realist literature, you're thinking more about things as how they are. There's a didactic function to it. They're teaching a lesson, or there's some sort of moral to it in that sense. But when you go to these like the Baroque era, the Romantic era, the avant-garde era, and when I say avant-garde, that is really broad speaking. That's speaking very broad terms. That's all of the isms. When you get into when you get into art history, you start thinking about Monet and all the isms, the expressionism and pointillism with Seurat and all the isms that are in there. Existentialism would definitely enter in this phase also, in a lot of the poetry and a lot of the philosophy. But anyways, this would be more subject, because in the object, people are thinking about social issues. In subject, people are thinking about personal issues, like the self. So, you'd have in the subjective, you'd have a lot more emotion. In the object, you'd have a lot more to do with reason. In the subject, you have a lot more to do with the self, individual expression. When in the object, you have a lot more to do with observation and scientific approach and saying things the way they are. So in the Romantic era, if in Romantic poetry, it's just all poetry about the self. You have this phase of poetry where like the poet will write about an absolute, write about an absolute. So everything's perfect, life's beautiful, and then they get into this high point where they say, oh well, now maybe it's not as good as it is. So then they start getting into the phase of disillusionment, and then it all goes downhill from there. And then the end of the poetry in the Romantic era is usually super depressing and might even end up in suicide or early death, or a lot of the poets had that sort of end. So it's the type of subjective. So you see the subjectivism in all of these. No matter really what movement, these can be applied to literature or art or music. If you've got a different ear, you can hear the difference between Baroque music and neoclassic music. For example, Bach as opposed to Beethoven. And it's applied to what we're doing. Renaissance literature, Baroque, neoclassic, Romantic, And when we're talking about Romantic literature, we can enter here with a lot of the poetry of the Emerson and Thoreau in this case. No, in the realist, we can enter here some of the Elizabethan literature, but not all of it's realist. But there's a lot of subsections in here. But just thinking about that, it's really interesting to see how it grows like that. It's like a breathing. It goes subject, object, subject, object. It's like a pair of lungs that have breathed throughout history. And you could see this into the 20th century, avant-garde. I mean, just think about the movements in the 20th century. If you want to move ahead, you've got the 20s, and then you've got the conservatism of the 50s, and the 60s were very, the 60s were very, very liberal, and then we became conservative again, and then in the 90s we had, this movement where everything became super liberal again, in the music and a lot of the expression, and it's really hard to see this all in a unit until you've completely gone through the era, and you've had maybe 20, 50 years to be able to see the movement after that in order to compare the movement before it to it. But definitely there's a pattern in what's going on here from about 1200 AD to 1920 or 1930 here. So it's just, I just thought I'd point this out because it's a really interesting way to look at the overall development of Western thought in this way.